Dr. Scott Bruce, tell me a little bit about yourself and your work.
Okay, my name is Scott Bruce. I'm a medieval historian. I specialize in the so-called early Middle Ages, so between about the years 400 and 1200, the long early Middle Ages. I'm primarily a historian of religion and culture, a historian of Christianity, and I'm particularly interested in monks. So people who have devoted their lives to religious principles that mean that they live apart from society and they give up many of the things that we enjoy in our lives in order to achieve a kind of spiritual ideal. I'm fascinated by the way monks in the Middle Ages perceived their world, the texts they read that informed those perceptions, and the texts that they created to express those things.
Have you adapted any medieval monkish habits in your own life?
No, I find them really, I can't get behind most of them. So for instance, I'm not celibate. I have a wife and children. I'm a great imbiber of alcohol in ways that perhaps they were not. Well, great, I'm not sure that's the right phrase, but I do have a tonsure, but it's not self-imposed. And yes, we belong to the same order, it seems. And but I am, you know, even though I do not identify with their ideals, I respect their how difficult it was for them to meet them. And that's in part what makes them so fascinating to me, is that they are wedded to a set of very difficult and strict ideals that I could never hope to meet.
Well, assuming that monks then weren't the first thing that attracted you to the Middle Ages and medieval history, what did first attract you to the Middle Ages?
Well, I come from a non-academic background. I'm a first-generation college student, and I grew up in a house that had almost no books. My mother read Reader's Digest, and my father read the newspaper. And but thankfully, my father was a pretty heavy smoker, and so he would send me down from a very early age, send me down to the store to buy him cigarettes. And but he would always give me a quarter for a comic book. And so after a while, my comic stack got pretty high, and I found myself being drawn, this is in the 1970s, to you know, comic books with fantasy themes. And those often allied with kind of medieval motifs. And so I was reading comics about Conan the Barbarian and other sword and sorcery comics that that probably were my first entree into medieval themes. And then those were the gateway drug, as it were, for various you know, paperbacks of everything from pulp fiction from the 1930s and 40s to, of course, Tolkien and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And then came Dungeons and Dragons. So there's a whole kind of mixture, as it were, of popular culture in the late 70s and early 80s that informed my view of what the pre-modern past might be like. Most of it, of course, not correct, but still enough to give me a taste for, you know, to pursue further. And that pursuit didn't come until college, but nonetheless, by then I was kind of primed, as it were, by all this popular culture.
Great. Well, now that you've been teaching for a couple of years or a couple of decades, do you have a sense from your students of whether the same, how similar or different the things that draw people to the Middle Ages are today from what drew you to the Middle Ages?
Oh, absolutely. So for my students, Tolkien is still a very big draw for them, but Tolkien and Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are now movies and not books. So they've encountered all of this on the big screen. So movies have played a huge role for students, at least my students. And the other thing that played, like the equivalent, so whereas I had the books and they have the movies, and I had tabletop gaming like Dungeons and Dragons, and now they have video games. So I almost never encounter students who aren't gamers in one way or another, and which is awesome. I've become a gamer too, and I like playing medieval themed games. But gaming has done so much to inform my students' interest in the Middle Ages, and particularly in the kind of esoteric corners of the Middle Ages I like to teach, you know, things about dragons and the undead and the afterlife and things like that. My students come with kind of ready-made notions of what all these things are and how they work, because they've been completely informed by the video games that they play.
Well, we'll come back to dragons and the undead, but what of the notions about the Middle Ages that people come into your classes with, are there any sort of general sort of impressions that people have, and are any of those, do you find, you know, misleading or things that you feel like responsible to correct in some ways?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is that I think that this may in part be the fault of Monty Python, but when I teach my classes on the early Middle Ages or just surveys on the Middle Ages, there is this notion that that it is kind of a, you know, intellectually and scientifically a kind of a backward time, and so there's the main challenge that I face is trying to convey to students that medieval people, the people that lived 1500 years ago or whenever, were as emotionally and intellectually complex and as curious and creative as we are. They had limited, you know, they may have been limited in terms of how they could express themselves. They may have had limited access to certain kinds of information, but given the effort and the labor that it took for them to produce intellectual products like texts and expressed in manuscripts, they were, I think, incredibly energetic and creative in the way they went about things. And so, so I think I'm always kind of fighting against this notion that we are better than they are, that the stuff we have is better, that the access we have is better. But I'm really, so much of my mission is trying to teach students that these were real people who lived as complex lives as we live, certainly emotionally and intellectually, and that we have to take them seriously.
Great. Well, speaking of taking seriously, what I have your hot off the presses Penguin Book of Dragons here,
Yeah.
which of course is part of a trilogy, so far a trilogy, I guess. The others are Penguin Book of the Undead and Penguin Book of Hell. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So what do people get right or wrong about dragons?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. So the history of dragons is very, very old. It goes back to the beginnings of human literature. Some of the earliest Sanskrit texts that we have are actually hymns relating to a battle about a hero between a hero and a dragon. And certainly in Greek and Roman mythology, dragons play an important role. And of course, those traditions all inform the medieval Christian notions of what dragons are. And the image of the dragon in the pre-modern period is actually fairly static. They tend to be symbolic, allegorical representations of various vices, various dangers that humankind faces, sometimes real, sometimes spiritual. This is very different in some ways from the ways that modern fantasy has constructed dragons. And in part, this is because there was a big shift in the way people thought about dragons at the end of the 19th century. So what we get wrong when you imagine what dragons are like in the ancient world or the medieval world, what we tend to get wrong is the aspects of dragon culture that modern literature has informed us of. So for instance, dragons in the pre-modern period almost never spoke, whereas dragons in fantasy literature talk all the time, right? Smaug in The Hobbit, or Yavod in Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea. These are dragons, part of whose power is expressed through their speech. And their speech is almost incantatory and beguiling. It's part of who they are, and part of how they try and defeat people that they are allowed to talk to. Dragons in the pre-modern period are almost always bestial. That is, they almost never talk. They're almost always treated as animals of some kind. And in this way, George R.R. Martin kind of gets dragons right, because they are his dragons. They don't speak. They are, you know, they are controlled by a person, but they almost never. They're not intelligent beings in and of themselves for the most part. At least they're generally not depicted that way. That is a big aspect of dragon lore. The other thing is that women in modern literature are very much involved with dragons, and of course Daenerys Targaryen is one of the most popular characters thanks to HBO. And women in the pre-modern period had almost nothing to do with dragons. Almost every dragon story is about a man, and because dragons are there primarily to be the the great big bad guy who the heroes fight as a way to test their heroism. And women just are not depicted in martial terms that way. And even the very few female saints in the Christian traditions that encounter dragons tend not to fight them in the, in the modern sense of combat. They tend, in the case of Martha, she's swallowed by a dragon and she prays into the dragon's stomach and she bursts out, thereby killing the dragon and also becoming the patron saint of childbirth. And I think it's Margaret is the other one who, kind of tames a dragon, puts her girdle around its neck and leads it to town where the townspeople kill it with spears. So whereas in the modern world, women are, have played a very active role in controlling dragons and in dealing with dragons and whatnot. And the big change in dragon culture really takes place in the late 19th century when we begin to see children's stories being written about dragons that subvert this idea that heroes come and they kill the dragon, and instead these are children who stories about children who befriend dragons and then keep them as pets, and thereafter the domestication of dragons becomes one of the central motifs of 20th century fantasy literature. So the How to Train Your Dragons, and we even see it again in Game of Thrones. Those dragons are, even though they're weapons of war, they are basically domesticated. Although part of the tension of that narrative is how well domesticated are they. Mm-hmm. So that's where we see, I don't want to say getting right or getting wrong, but that's where we see modern fantasy is, creates a preconception of what dragons are like in ways that doesn't always match up to the pre-modern depiction of them.
So medieval people would be surprised at how closely we associate dragons with the Middle Ages.
I think so, and I think they would be horrified to think that we've somehow harnessed them to our own use, since they're almost always in the Middle Ages depicted as some kind of personification of the devil or some kind of minion of the devil. The idea that we could control them and then use them to, for whatever purpose, whether for our own entertainment or whether to fight other people, I think would be pretty shocking to them.
Yeah. Well, lastly, you clearly keep up with all sorts of popular media that involve the Middle Ages, and it seems like you really enjoy it as well. I guess you mentioned how it sounds like your gaming that you've shifted a bit with the time. So is there are there particular games or forms of games that you enjoy the most now, both as a gaming person, but also as a person who knows an awful lot about the Middle Ages?
Well, I don't think anything beats a Sunday afternoon dining room table Dungeons and Dragons experience, which has become much harder in the age of the pandemic, where it's hard to get people together. And it doesn't, and I've never played Dungeons and Dragons online, in a Zoom setting or something like that. I just can't see it having the same potential. But so that's my ideal, but that's very hard to achieve. And my face-to-face encounters with gaming now is as I play Pokemon with my 10-year-old, because this is what she's interested in. I want to, encourage any kind of gaming that my kids want to do. For me, it's my haven for the last decade or more has been massively multiplayer online games. So I play World of Warcraft and have since 2008. And that is my go-to. And I have, longstanding online friends that I've never met in person, who I've nonetheless spent hours with online and know their voices intimately in my headset because of stories that we've shared in that game. And of course, World of Warcraft is a whole other topic. It's replete with medieval motifs, and many of which are inaccurate, some of which are charming. But it does a whole lot to inform my gamer friends, none of whom know I'm a medieval historian, as to what the Middle Ages is. But I don't try and disabuse them of that. I just want to enjoy the game for what it is.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to talk, and look forward to seeing the next Penguin book anthology. I can't imagine what follows Dragons, Hell, and the Undead.
I can't imagine you. There's a little bit of penguin fatigue right now.
Penguin fatigue. It's an epidemic of its own, I guess.
Yes, indeed.
Well, thanks very much, Scott.
You bet. Great to talk to you.